Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my Winter Deck Collection video 2020 edition. So today we're going to take a look at some of the decks that I like to use during the darker months of the year. So let's go ahead and take a look at the decks, and these are in no particular order, but you will notice that I kind of have a theme of decks that I tend to go to during those darker months of the year. And they tend to be the decks that are a little bit darker in my collection in tone or in their design, as well as decks that have really minimalistic colors. So I tend to use a lot of monochromatic decks, a lot of black and white decks, and a lot of decks, as we'll see here, with very minimal color to them. So this particular deck is the Solera Occulti Tarot. This is the first edition, and I have trimmed it. This is one of my absolute favorite decks in my collection. I love the artwork on this deck, and I love the way that it reads. Now, this is a deck that I do use year-round. However, ever since I've gotten it, I do feel like it has a bit more of a winter months vibe for me. And again, like I said, that tends to be the decks that have a little bit more minimalistic colors to them, a little bit more monochromatic. And while this deck does have pops of color, it is definitely a little bit more on the darker side in terms of the tone of the artwork, not necessarily the nature of the deck. So I don't tend to really go for dark decks as in dark and creepy decks during this time of year. What I tend to be drawn to is decks that have a little bit less color to them. And I think that is because of the nature of the season itself. This deck also, because of its color scheme, also feels very late autumn to me as well. So it definitely tends to be one I pull out late autumn and then into winter. Although, as I mentioned, it is definitely a deck that I use year round because it is definitely one of my favorites. That little guy's upside down. The Hanged Man. He's upside down. So this is definitely one of my favorite decks to use in my collection, but it's also one that I'm finding tends to have a bit more of a winter energy to me, and so thus it's in my winter basket, and it tends to be one that I think I'm going to be drawn to more in the darker months of the year. Now, this deck is, I think I bought it, it's fairly new to my collection. I've had it maybe just a year. So I've really only gone through one whole season with it. I started working with it at the beginning of 2020. And while it's come really into its own into my practice, it's definitely a deck that I have tended to use more in the darker months at the beginning of the year. And now that we're coming into the darker months at the end of the year, it's another one that I've definitely been drawn to. So that's definitely a favorite in my collection for the darker or winter months, and that is the Solera Occulti Tarot. I have trimmed this copy, and I do have a video on my channel in case you'd like to check that out. So a newer deck to my collection, which I've just done a walkthrough of not too long ago, is the Revival Art Tarot. Now, this is one that I haven't really had a chance to use much, but it definitely has, I think, a bit of a winter vibe for me. And I think that is primarily due to those darker colors. Like I said, while it has all the range of colors in it, they are a bit more muted. And so I think that's what tends to lend it into more of the late autumn and then into winter months. I would say this is more of an autumnal deck for me, except for I feel like some of the darker cards really kind of help it bridge the gap between the two seasons. Now, when I talk about decks in my collection that I use seasonally, that doesn't mean that I don't use them year round. I certainly do, but they have that sort of energy for that season for me, that association for me. And so it tends to be that I use them primarily more in those months that it relates to that season for me. And that's how I've kind of managed to corral my deck collection, is to give each deck sort of a job or a season. So each deck either serves a purpose in my practice or it fits a seasonal energy in my practice, and therefore it allows me to kind of catalog things and keep things in their different baskets, and just makes it so that I know where things are, is really what it comes down to. But I do like to use my decks very seasonally, and so this is one that I feel like is a very sort of late fall, early winter deck for me, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know it more because it is definitely a newer deck in my collection. So this one is the Revival Art Tarot, which again I said is a newer deck in my collection. So I haven't had much time to work with it, and maybe that's why I'm kind of putting it in this category, is so that I do get a chance to work with it this year. But I do feel like it has a bit of a late autumn, early winter vibe to me. And I think that's just because the energy and the colors and all of the colors, because it's old artwork, they're a bit muted. And so that kind of lends itself to that that time of year for me. So another deck that I tend to be drawn to throughout the darker months of the year is the Darkness of Light Tarot. And I think that is primarily due to the color palette of this deck. It does have a definite darker color palette to it. And again, when I say darker, I am talking mostly in terms of the aesthetic of the deck, not necessarily the energy or the overall feeling of the deck. It is darker in tone. It has a darker color palette, maybe things like black borders. And so this is one that I definitely tend to pull out more in the darker times of the year. Again, it does have a lot of autumnal colors in it. We have a lot of browns and reds and oranges and things of that nature, but we do have the little pops of color as well. But I think it's really just the heaviness of these cards. There's a very distinct weight to the colors, to the palette that's used in this deck. And even when we have cards here, like see the Ten of Cups, where we do have this kind of maybe more lighter imagery or lighter idea of this sort of happily ever after, we definitely still get kind of a sense of heaviness and darkness to this card. And again, because we have the darkness down here, and even up here, we can see that sort of kind of gray clouds. Yes, we have the bright spot in the center illuminating the little happy family, but overall the card does still feel quite dark and heavy. And whether it's the imagery itself or the colors in this deck, everything in this deck feels kind of shadowed, kind of heavy. And for me, that's really what brings it out to be a winter deck for me. I think that some of the little accents, the little splashes of paint also kind of look a little bit, as we can see here, look a little bit like kind of snow to me. And so I think maybe that's another thing that makes me think of winter. Even here, when we have like this sort of field with flowers, we still are getting the little white specks, and it still kind of has a darkness to it. And I think that this deck is absolutely beautiful. It's one of my favorites in my collection. And it reads really wonderfully, but it definitely has that sense of winter to me, of things being kind of, I think of things as being darker and heavier and more weighty during the winter months. And perhaps that is tied in mostly to my personal practice and how I work with that seasonal energy myself. But I think this deck really beautifully encompasses that energy. And if we look here at the color palette, I mean, definitely has some autumnal feel to it, right? In all the, like, look at that 9 of coins there. I mean, that is like autumn in a card. However, there's still some heaviness and darkness within the shadow. And I think that is just absolutely beautiful in this deck. And I love the way it pulls that energy in. So definitely one of my favorites. So another deck in my collection that I tend to be drawn to more in the winter or the darker months is the Moon Void Tarot. Now this one is a primarily black and white deck, and I think that's one of the reasons why I tend to be drawn to it this time of year. As you'll see throughout this video, this collection, most of the decks that I choose to incorporate into my practice during this time of year tend to be primarily illustrated decks, tend to be primarily black and white, or they tend to be really have a really dark color palette. And while this one does have pops of color, it is primarily a black and white deck, and I think it is that stark contrast that really brings in that energy of sort of winter to me. Things are very much in contrast in winter. We can get really, really dark, heavy, ominous days, at least here in the Pacific Northwest. And then we can have days where it is, you know, covered in snow and everything's white and shining and pretty, but it's still really freaking cold outside. And I think that is really kind of what that black and white starkness really draws me to that seasonal energy. This one is one that actually, it really surprised me because this deck features this one figure, this one character that we see throughout the deck, and I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about that. And I think I've mentioned that before in other videos, but it actually does really work for me. And I like that use of the one character. And what I really like is that the majority of the minors don't necessarily have a character in them. So it's a little bit more on the pip side, and I really like that. So here we can see with the 9 of Cups, like there's no people in this, it's just cups. And I think that for the most part that works really well. And I think because it does have the same figure all throughout, I'm not so much drawn to the figure itself, to the person in the card. I'm more of looking at the scene that's being depicted in the card. And I think that using that same figure, I love that card. I don't know why it's upside down. I think that using that same figure actually allows me to kind of distance myself from this person and just to kind of see it for the energy of the card or the scene being depicted. And so that's kind of how I like to work with that one. Again, this is another deck that I really enjoy working with during the kind of darker months of the year. I mean, look at that card. That's just winter in a card to me. Beautiful. And this is one that, I love this one too. This is one that I do definitely tend to use quite a bit. It's one that surprised me and I really do like working with it. So another deck that probably needs no introduction on my channel, but that I tend to use a lot in the winter months is the Anna K Tarot. This is the mass market edition and I have edged mine in black. I do have 2 editions of this deck, or 2 versions of this deck, because I have purchased 2 copies and I've trimmed 1 copy down to be pocket size, to be the same size as my Llewellyn, because I use them in readings together. And again, this is another deck that I definitely use year round. It is kind of, I call it my family counselor deck, because it's the deck that I tend to turn to whenever I have family things that I need to do readings about. And I really like the color palette in this deck. And I really love the expressions on the faces in this deck. This deck to me is very, very human. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. It's very stripped of sort of esoterica, and it focuses more, I think, on human nature and the emotion and the energy as portrayed through humanity. And I think that's really wonderful. I don't know if it's the black borders or the dark palette that really lends itself to that wintry energy for me, or possibly because of the way that I use this deck in terms of it being sort of my family counselor. And even though we have some really bright, beautiful yellow cards, there's still kind of a darkness and a heaviness to this deck that makes it feel very deep and very reflective. And I think that's kind of the energy that flows throughout all of these decks that I tend to use during the winter time. Is they tend to be very reflective decks for me, as in they encourage me to really dive beneath the surface, get under those shadows and see what's going on, to bring all of that that's hidden in the darkness into the light so that I can, illuminate it, acknowledge it, understand it, work through it, whatever it is that I need to do. And these particular decks tend to be ones that help me do that. And so I think that that's another reason why they tend to be decks that I use during the winter time, because that tends to be when I do a lot of that kind of work. And this deck is absolutely fabulous for that. Like I said, I use it a lot for family readings, but I also use it a lot for myself, because this deck to me, it really helps me connect to humanity and to my own humanity, because this deck does feel very human. So it definitely has, kind of an autumnal feel as well. And you'll notice that's kind of a theme throughout some of these decks. They could very easily probably be considered, autumn decks. especially with this, we had these, you know, bright, beautiful yellow backgrounds, which I love in this deck. But overall, the energy to me does relate more to my personal practice and what I do in the winter time. And so I think that's why it's a deck that ends up being on my table more often during the winter. But again, it is one that I totally used year round because it is definitely one of my favorites. So another deck that tends to come out more for me in the winter months is the Beto Tarot. I love the artwork in this deck, and we're back to, I don't know if it's because it's a deck that really encourages that sort of deep dive, or it's the black borders, but this deck really does have that sort of winter, darker month energy to me. Although this Fool, I love him. He feels almost spring, right? But overall, I think that this deck really invites you to dive deep within. And I think that's one of the reasons why it tends to be one that I work with more in the winter time. I really like the depictions in this deck. It's, of course, very inclusive. And it has a bit of a more numerological take on it. I love this Devil card. He's one that a lot of people, like, you love him or hate him. And I really like the bringing the devil down to a human level. And I think that's really interesting. It is glossy and it is gold gilded, and it is like all the things that I don't like in a deck in terms of the production of a deck. But I love this deck anyway. As you can see, I've completely left it as it is. I haven't taken the gilding off. I haven't taken the borders off. I've left it as it is because I just feel like this deck works as it is, even though it has a couple of different elements to it that are not my favorite, but it works beautifully the way it is, so I've completely left it. So another deck that I tend to use more in the darker months, which actually really took me a long time to create a connection with this deck, is the Wild Unknown Tarot. And I kind of had resistance to this deck for quite a while. It just didn't make a connection for me. And it took me some time to really get to know it and to work with it. I've had it for a really long time. This is the mass market edition, but I've had it for a really, really long time. And it wasn't until the beginning of 2020 that I decided to really try to make a connection with it and really to dive deep into it. And so perhaps that's why I tend to think of it as sort of a wintry deck, is because it was in January, in the darker months of the year, that I was working with this deck for the first time. Not for the first time, but to really dive deep into it and to really spend some time getting to know it. And that, I think, really helped me create the connection. And so perhaps that is why I see it as a sort of wintry month deck. However, I think the imagery itself does also kind of play into that as well, because we have a lot of darkness, a lot of heaviness to a lot of these cards. And again, that energy is what pulls in that sort of wintry vibe to me, that darkness, the heaviness. And then again, we also have the stark contrast of the white and the black, because this is primarily a black and white deck, and we just have some pops of color. Or in this case, we have a lot of color, but it's still really rooted in the sort of monochromatic with just some hints of primary color in it. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it really ties back into that winter months for me, is kind of the heaviness of it. So this one has taken me, some time to kind of come around to, some time to work with. It's still not like the ultimate favorite in my collection, but I enjoy it enough to keep it around. And it's something that, I intend to work with some more. So now let's jump into a couple of oracle decks that I tend to use during the darker months. This one will be of no surprise if you've seen some of my oracle videos, and it is the Flowers of the Night Oracle. Beautiful backs. I love this deck. It works so well with so many of my tarot decks, and it's one that I just really enjoy the artwork in. Again, we have that sort of dark background with those really bright pops of color, but it is primarily a black and white deck. The color is very intentional, and it's just in certain areas of the card. So looking where that color is also really interesting. But this is one that I use for all kinds of tarot readings. It tends to be one that comes out with a lot of my decks. It's very versatile. It looks beautifully with a lot of my different tarot decks, but more importantly than that, it reads really well. So it has beautiful conversations with my tarot, and it really does help to draw out those deeper messages or to provide a focus for me depending on how I'm using it in a reading. I just absolutely love this deck. It's kind of one of my go-to oracle decks when I'm working with tarot and oracle together. And this is just beautiful artwork. I love the way that this artist has created this deck and created this artwork. I think it's just absolutely stunning, very eye-catching. I have, of course, edged mine in green. But that is the Flowers of the Night Oracle. So another oracle deck that tends to come out during the winter months is the Shamanic Healing Oracle cards. And this one is another one that, like, it's got glossy cardstock, it is gold gilded, it even has the name on the back. I don't care, I love this deck. One of the things that I really like about this deck, or this creator's decks, because I have quite a few of them, is the sort of primal nature of the artwork. I think that it is really beautiful. It really taps into something sort of, like I said, primal, very human actually in this deck. And I love that it kind of blends all of those kind of light and dark aspects together into one in this particular oracle. The messages are always really spot on. I really like the keywords. I have seen this deck trimmed down borderless and it looks gorgeous, but I do quite like the keywords and the messages in the guidebook. And so I've left them on so that I can work with those elements as well as pulling in the intuitive hits from the artwork, because I do get great intuitive hits off this artwork, even though it is a bit on the minimalistic side, even though it is a bit more primitive. I find that it really does act as a wonderful gateway to intuitive insight. And again, it's another one that I really like to pair with my tarot decks, because I think it does a beautiful job of pulling out those deeper messages. So another favorite in my collection, and one that I don't know if you can tell by these sides, but one that is quite well used and one that I really enjoy pairing with my tarot decks, that is the Shamanic Healing Oracle cards. So another oracle deck that I tend to like to use during the darker months, or I should say I intend to use during the darker months because I really haven't had it that long, is the Sacred Destiny Oracle. I don't remember when this came out. I think it was this year, but I think because I tend to pair this with my black and white decks, I think that's why it kind of pulls at that energy for me. It really does work beautifully to pair with a black and white deck, and I think because you get that sort of really detail in this particular imagery, which is photo collage, and the stark contrast to the black and white, and often in my collection those are illustrated decks, and so it creates a really wonderful sort of opposites and really great balance. And I talked about that in my oracle video on balance in my oracle and tarot decks. And so this is one that I tend to, or intend to, I guess I should say, work with in the darker months. It's one that kind of sits in that basket with those decks, because those are the decks that I tend to be drawn to using this one with. Granted, this is an oracle deck that would work any time of the year. I think all of my decks would work any of the time of the year. And as I've said, I do use them year round. We're just talking about decks that I tend to use primarily during certain seasons. And this one, I really do like the white borders, which I know, I can't believe I said that either, but I really do like the white borders. It creates a wonderful framework around the image. And I think because the way that I use this particular deck is just to pull a single card and then build a tarot reading around it, I think that's why the borders work really well for me, because it creates kind of a containment, a framework, and then I build out from there. But I think this is one that would work any time of the year beautifully. But I just really love the way that it really creates a beautiful balance between my black and white decks. And I think that's why I tend to have it in this box and use with these particular decks. So this is one that I do quite like the artwork, most of it. There are a few cards that don't really float my boat, but you know, overall I think it's a beautifully created deck, and the production quality of this deck is fantastic. It's gorgeous, matte, it has wonderful cardstock, and it's a joy to actually hold and work with. And so that's another thing that I really enjoy about it. So that is the Sacred Destiny Oracle. So the last deck that I want to share with you today is the Oracle of Echoes. And this is last but certainly not least because this is actually a favorite oracle in my collection. This is an indie oracle, of course, by Anatolian. And this is an oracle that I definitely tend to use more in the darker months of the year. Again, because it really taps into those really reflective energies. So when we're really taking, funny, I was just getting ready to say, when we're really taking that time to look within, to really dive deep within ourselves and to explore kind of our own depths, this deck works beautifully for that. I do pair it quite often with Oracle or with tarot decks, but it does work beautifully as a standalone oracle as well. And I have used it many times on its own just to do readings within this deck on its own terms, because it does have a wonderful balance of sort of positive and negative, or light and shadow, however you want to look at it. There's a wonderful balance in this deck, and so that makes it a wonderful reader all on its own, but it also makes it a really powerful tool to expand a tarot reading. And I love the way that it speaks to a lot of my different decks. But again, we're really talking about the energy or the work that I do with the deck, and that's really what pulls it into being a sort of winter deck, because for me, it's all a deck about looking within and really diving deep into self. And I think this deck works beautifully for that. Gorgeous. And of course, I just love the artwork. I mean, look at that. So beautiful. Gorgeous artwork. This is one of those decks that I could just sit here and look through the artwork. Stunning. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.